If your parents didn't know how to emotionally regulate themselves, and thus they didn't know how to help you regulate your emotions as a child, your experience of certain emotions is going to be that they are scary. This is because this view of emotions was projected on you by your parents. They suppressed their own emotions and taught you to do the same. It is therefore a generational curse. It is one, however, that must be healed if you are to ever have truly fulfilling relationships with others and even with yourself. If you feel like emotions are scary, this video is for you. Now, there are cognitive reasons for fearing emotions, but we'll address that at another time. This video focuses on the nurture aspect of emotional regulation. In many Christian circles, we have been taught to view our children like the lost. They are unsaved heathens until they grow up enough to profess faith in Christ and start behaving. It's interesting that Jesus didn't see children like this. In fact, when his disciples wanted to send the children away with all their damn volatility and emotions, Jesus said, "You can't enter my kingdom unless you become like one of these children." That must have been confusing to the disciples and those around Jesus because they saw spirituality as being put together. However, Jesus always wanted authenticity. Authenticity equals humility equals admitting our need. And the reality is none of us is truly put together. The difference with a child is that they're authentic about it. No one is more authentic and real than a child. Children haven't yet suppressed their emotions and grown into a mental space where they try to prove that they're put together. In fact, children were the exact opposite of the Pharisees, who were completely inauthentic, and as Jesus referred to them, whitewashed tombs. They were put together on the outside, but totally vacant spiritually in their hearts. I think there are multiple aspects of childlikeness that Jesus was drawing on when he said this to those around him, but I want to focus on one specific aspect of being a child, and that is emotional vulnerability. As children, our feelings come and go freely. Before the age of 8, we haven't really learned how to regulate them, and our cognitive functions are still developing. We actually have less memories during this time because at this point in our development, we live in much more of a feeling state. Parents who view these free-flowing emotions as a curse instead of a blessing, or an inconvenience, or as manipulation, or as sin that needs to be beat out of a child, actually end up destroying and devastating the child's sense of self. What the child learns is that my authentic self is not acceptable. They learn that certain emotions like happiness are okay, but others like sadness, anger, and frustration are wrong. Often in these households, compliance and external behavior modification are the main goal, and the child's emotional health takes a back seat to their detriment. This is not to say that bad behavior shouldn't be addressed. However, I think we need to work on the distinction between the action that is the sin and the emotion behind that. Scripture even says, "Be angry and do not sin." Scripture never demonizes emotion. We can help our kids learn how to handle emotions appropriately. We can allow our children to feel and make emotional space for them while being directive, kind, and helpful at the same time. We can guide our children without neglecting to let them feel. Because the child is completely dependent on their caretakers for love and connection, they have no choice but to adapt to their parents' emotional capacity or meet the emotional bar of their caretakers. This is a coping mechanism that happens because the child realizes that they get emotionally rejected for expressing themselves in certain ways that is beyond the parent's emotional capacity. The child realizes that big emotions are not acceptable to the parent. So after a while, children will start to mirror the parent's view of these various emotions. They have to cope. The parents are ashamed of these emotions in themselves and in their children, and therefore the child starts to feel an intense feeling of shame for that emotional expression. The parents handle these emotions the way that their parents taught them to handle them, and the way that they have continued to play out these learned relationship habits throughout their lives and emotional habits. Any emotion of the child that is not unconditionally accepted by the parents is eventually suppressed, and the child splits that part of themselves and essentially rejects part of who they are. They do this to survive in an attempt to thrive in the family in which they're raised. While it's an amazing survival tactic, it's destructive to the identity of the individual child because a genuine, authentic part of who they are is essentially locked in a room in their heart and becomes part of the subconscious mind. The pain of feeling these emotions and not being accepted is too much to bear. So the brain copes by disassociating and rejecting that part of itself. The child, who is excellent at experiencing the world emotionally, silences a real part of themselves and begins to lower their emotional bar. We will continue to lower that bar until it reaches the exact emotional level of the parent so that we are accepted and loved by them. There's a big difference between learning to process emotions maturely and completely rejecting a part of yourself and moving it into your subconscious mind. Unfortunately, most of us experience the second outcome. We tolerate being treated a certain way by people because we learned to tolerate that in our families. We lowered our emotional bar. And as long as no one oversteps that new learned emotional boundary, we're okay. The implication of this is that we learn to believe being treated the way our parents treated us and treating others this way is acceptable. If you had emotionally competent parents, this is a good thing. If not, it's obviously a bad thing. The more we neglected our emotions in childhood, the lower the bar, the lower view of self we have throughout life. The more of ourselves we reject, the worse the symptoms in life. The further down this hole of emotional suppression you go, you start to find more destructive behaviors like narcissism, dissociative identity disorder, depression, etc. That suppressed energy can also manifest itself in ailments, diseases, and other physiological issues. There is a massive correlation between crime and disorders to parents who are completely absent and or emotionally abandon their children. But more commonly across the board, we see destructive and manipulative relationships because of these unstable emotional patterns. Love is a choice for sure, but there is no real love without an emotional component. Therefore, if someone's emotional capacity is lowered, their capacity to love and accept others for who they are is also lowered. The thing is, we tend to attract others at the same emotional level throughout life. So as adults, we get into relationships with other people with similar emotional trauma and similar emotional suppression. This can happen in a lot of ways, but one way is that people with deep traumas tend to jump into big relationship commitments really, really fast. Therefore, only other people willing to go at an unhealthy pace with them will play this game. Desperation is never a sign of health. Someone with a high emotional bar, with mature emotional awareness, a high view of self, and a deep awareness about what they need or want will not play this game. And therefore, someone with trauma will push someone healthy away pretty quickly. You are naturally going to attract someone at roughly your same emotional capacity. So, what do? We end up in relationships with others who were taught in some way similar to us that emotions were bad and not acceptable. These relationships, especially in partnerships, are often not sustainable because two people in a relationship that have rejected a part of themselves or don't really know themselves result in an unhealthy bond. Let me be clear when I say they're not sustainable. I'm not saying people actually get out of these relationships. I'm saying it is impossible to maintain health long-term in these bonds. Many people will actually stay unconsciously in their traumas their whole lives, so they can tough it out with a marriage with the person they don't really love. Or they might get a divorce, but they will continue to attract the exact same type of people with future relationships. This is why people who typically get divorces get more divorces in the future. It's because they haven't healed the trauma in themselves and they are on a frivolous hunt for someone else to heal their traumas. What's happening is they are being subconsciously controlled and manipulated by the unmet needs of the inner child that they have ignored and refused to heal. The problem is the type of people they will continue to attract that their mirrored emotional capacity can never heal them and will exacerbate their problems. So they go in an endless loop, ignoring that they're their own worst enemy. Regardless of whether an unhealthy couple stays together suffering or they get divorced and repeat the cycle with someone else, they never do the self-work to heal the core problem, and therefore, they never experience fulfillment in relationships. This is why the trauma is passed on to future generations over and over again. In these type of relationships, both partners will subconsciously expect the other to address the unmet needs of the ignored inner child, and there will be frequent blow-ups, disconnect, and a lack of harmony in the relationship. You might not necessarily know why you can't get along, but it's buried in your subconscious, and your relationships will be volatile. Remember, emotions are energy in motion. So if you have suppressed any part of your emotional self, it will surface in many areas of life, especially in relationships. The lower our emotional bar, the less healthy people we are, the less healthy people we attract, and the more volatile and destructive our relationships are with those people. So, how do we start to heal, address our unmet emotional needs, discover who we are, and start to build healthy relationships with others? I'm going to give you some steps. Number 1, be conscious of it. You have to become aware that there is a part of you that is emotionally traumatized. You have to realize that your emotional bar is lower than it should be. If you have volatile relationships, this is a good sign that this is the case. It can be difficult to look in the mirror, but it's critical if we want to heal, we take the time to see ourselves for who we are. Also, realize that much of it is learned behavior. You're responsible for your behavior for sure, but be kind with yourself and understand that you did learn it from somebody else. Your emotional capacity was in many ways inherited from your parents. Number 2, be okay being uncomfortable. Once you first become conscious that your emotional bar and expectations are very low, it will become very, very uncomfortable to listen to your emotions. Don't forget that this is why you have avoided that part of you all these years. You might even hear the voice of your parents resisting in your mind. You might feel that you're being overly sensitive and ridiculous. Don't forget, this is the voice of your parents that made you repress the emotions and reject a part of you in the first place. Despite whatever doubting you experience in your mind, you must be okay with your emotions. You must learn to accept that part of yourself so you can learn to regulate emotions in a healthy manner. This will bring healing. Number 3, comfort your inner child. You must revisit your inner child that is locked in the room of your heart and hear its cries and comfort it. To do this, you will have to do some digging. Remember, these parts of you are subconscious. That means that you don't spend conscious time thinking about them. It's going to take some work to discover them. One helpful way to root these subconscious parts of yourself up is to dig into your addictions, unhealthy desires, and into your broken relationships and the various fruits of a hurting inner child. For example, if a certain behavior in your partner makes you very angry or a friend triggers you, ask yourself why. If you struggle with an addiction, ask yourself what you were trying to escape when you first got hooked. As you dig, you will often find beneath these external manifestations a hurting inner child. So you can go in a room by yourself and do some deep breathing and just meditate on your childhood and think about some situations where you felt your emotions were undermined. You can journal and write parts of your childhood story and what sort of emotions you experienced in those places. But either way, you have to revisit those places in your mind and then allow yourself to feel those feelings again. Once you find yourself in that place and sitting with those emotions again, you have to proactively reparent yourself. You have to speak to your inner child or write it letters as you're journaling. You have to tell it what your parents did not tell you. Tell yourself it's okay to feel. It's okay to pitch a fit. It's okay to be mad or angry or upset. Regardless of the emotions, tell your inner child that you're there for it no matter what. You can be the parent to that part of yourself that you never had. Even better, you can tell your inner child that Christ receives it with open arms. God is the perfect, unconditionally loving parent. Tell your inner child version of yourself that it didn't deserve the emotional abuse she received. Welcome every single emotion you feel and speak to yourself kindly. The key is letting yourself feel the emotion and letting yourself be okay with the emotions and not judging them. This process can take a long, long time, especially when you're first doing it, but walking through this and spending a lot of time in your memories doing this inner child work can be revolutionary for your healing journey. Not only will it help you stop discarding your own emotions and your own experiences and questioning your feelings all the time and the validity of your perspective, but it'll also make you kinder and more tender to others, especially your children if you have them. In the same way that you kindly start speaking to that inner child, you will mirror that in the way you speak to others and your own children. It's a process, so be patient and kind to yourself as you discover this neglected part of you. You will find yourself wanting to resist all along the way, so be okay with it. It takes a lot of time to unravel your habit to disassociate with those feelings and emotions. Number 4, discover who you are and become whole again. As you deep dive into your emotions and allow yourself to feel, you'll start becoming one with this rejected part of yourself. This wholeness you experience will bring a lot of peace and comfort. Remember, Jesus welcomes the most authentic emotional version of you. You will start discovering a much more holistic version of who you are, and it will bring healing. This inner healing will simultaneously change how you see yourself and the dynamic of all your relationships. Once someone is free from the constant self-shaming, the fruits of addiction, depression, bad relationships, etc. will slowly die off because the shame is dead. Jesus is the only real way to heal from this shame. The gospel tells us that he bore our shame on the cross, and he welcomes you to be free from that shame and accepts all of you without reserve. So don't be afraid to let all of yourself out. You are allowed to. Jesus welcomes your discouraged and scared inner child to come to him with open arms. Being raw and authentic about your deepest feelings, emotions, and desires will bring extreme healing and freedom. You'll actually be free to love other people for who they are and say no to the addictions and unhealthy behaviors in your life, because there will stop being so much pain that you're having to avoid anymore. Remember, you only go to addictions and unhealthy behaviors to avoid something painful. Dealing with your emotional pain will give you incredible victory over your demons. Number 5, build new relationships and establish new boundaries. Boundaries are nothing more than letting others know how you will and won't be treated. You could not do this as a child because you needed your parents' connection despite their emotional behavior. There's nothing wrong, though, with letting others know respectfully what you expect of them in a relationship with you. If you feel uncomfortable with this, just remember you're projecting the fears of your inner child because your parents told you as a child setting boundaries wasn't okay. As you heal and comfort your inner child, this will become easier. Boundaries are actually relatively simple. If something makes you feel uncomfortable, it usually denotes that a boundary should be erected. Don't be surprised if those around you, unconscious of their emotions, are confused or pull away or reject you completely as you raise your emotional bar, and let them know how you expect to be treated. Remember, we're often drawn to those with the same emotional capacity and repelled from those on a different level. And therefore, if you start raising your bar by doing some self-work and healing, your current relationships can start to fall apart. And this can definitely discourage you in the process, but it is evidence you are growing. Now, I'm not saying intentionally abandon these relationships. I'm just letting you know this is one consequence of this process of being authentic with your emotions and starting to heal from your traumas. Your friends might comment or criticize you, telling you you're too sensitive, or try to make you feel insecure about your new boundaries. Your partner might become uncomfortable, become self-conscious, or angry and reject you. Your siblings might be confused. Your parents could tell you that this new relationship format is inappropriate. But you have to remember that people with low emotional bars hate boundaries. They will be offended by them. I'm going to talk in a later episode more about why, but just know people who have resolved their traumas and have a high emotional capacity will welcome and respect your boundaries. These are the type of people you want to surround yourself with for the sake of your long-term mental health. It's very important that you surround yourself during this time with people who accept you for who you are and accept your boundaries. It will be needed support in this difficult and painful, but very beneficial healing process. It's not bad to raise the bar on emotional awareness and awareness of yourself. It's not wrong to create new boundaries for relationships and let others know what you will and won't tolerate with them. Disallowing yourself to feel emotions is self-abuse, and if not dealt with, it will destroy you, and it will keep your relationships with others from being all that they could be. Those that don't want to respect your boundaries want freedom from emotional accountability. So it's usually a good idea to distance yourself from these people no matter who they are. Co-workers, partners, spouses, friends, siblings, parents. We have often belittled emotions and emotional attachment to the detriment of ourselves, our children, and our relationships, and we must stop doing this if we want to heal these areas. If you want to have great relationships, you have to have two individuals who are emotionally conscious and sensitive of their own emotions on a regular basis. It is in that space that they will be available and able to hear the emotions of another and really love them. Both of these individuals will have the humility to keep introspecting, and as a team, you can both continue raising your emotional bar and emotional awareness. Remember, it's a process. Emotionally aware people who are conscious of and okay with their own emotions are willing to hear and try to understand others' emotions. Emotionally immature individuals will often shame others for feeling because they have not dealt with their own emotional abandonment of themselves. Once we heal, we are willing to make space for emotions that might be different than our own, and to hear people and accept where they are, even if it's different than where we are. Many of us have been taught that certain feelings are ridiculous and that it is inappropriate to feel. This type of emotional judgment is emotional abuse. It will keep you from great relationships with yourself and with others. The only ones unwilling to call it abuse are the ones unwilling to see how destructive their behaviors really are to themselves and those around them. Becoming okay with your true, authentic emotions is a long process. Remember, you have for years and years rejected many authentic pieces of yourself, so you will not be healed overnight. You've been taught to question your perspective of situations, and because of emotional neglect, you gaslight yourself and the validity of your experience of the world. This is normal. It's going to take time to unwind. It will be uncomfortable, and you'll feel like you're doing something wrong. But this is not at all logical. It is how your brain was wired in childhood, nothing more. It's going to take years for the bar to raise, and even then, you'll never be perfect. None of us will. However, it's critical that we do the work to experience healing if we want to get the most out of life and if we truly want to be there for others. You can't truly love another to the fullest until you have worked to heal those unmet wounds in yourself. We must raise our emotional bar and be okay calling these types of emotional neglect abuse, as they are. It might be awkward for you to call it abuse because your parents' voices will echo in your mind, telling you you're being ridiculous. But look at their relationships and ask yourself, do they experience real, deep intimacy with one another? Do they have a relationship that I also would like to have? If you've gotten this far in the video, the answer is probably no, which is why you struggle with emotions in the first place. If your parents were not emotionally available to you like they should have been, it shouldn't surprise you that they're not truly emotionally available for one another either. And that's why you have no desire to mirror their relationships. And it's also why being told by your significant other that you're just like your father or your mother is so painful. Not wanting to have the same relationship your parents have with one another is a great indication that it's time to look in the mirror and ask yourself, what wounds have I not worked to heal? Has my emotional bar been unconsciously lowered? Do I tolerate emotional abuse from others? And do I belittle the emotions and feelings and perspective of those around me? God wants us to heal. He wants us to heal from these traumas. Jesus received the children happily, and he accepts your inner child too. Christ wants to comfort these unhealed wounds in your heart. He wants your relationships to be deep and strong and healthy. Will you raise your emotional bar and let him heal those wounds? He welcomes you to with open arms.